The irony became impossible to ignore when German prisoners worked alongside or near Black American soldiers. At numerous locations, the two groups performed similar labor under vastly different conditions. German prisoners received Geneva Convention protections, regular wages, adequate food, and respect as military combatants. Black soldiers faced discrimination, lower effective pay due to systematic exclusions from post exchanges and other facilities, and treatment as inferior citizens despite their American citizenship and military service. The Trimingham incident crystallized these contradictions. That morning in April 1944, standing in a Louisiana train station kitchen, watching enemy soldiers enjoy privileges denied to him, Corporal Rupert Trimingham made a decision. He would write to Yank, the Army weekly magazine distributed to millions of American servicemen. He would describe exactly what he witnessed. He would ask the questions that every black soldier was asking. Trimingham's letter appeared in the April 28, 1944 edition of Yank. The letter described his journey from Camp Claiborne to Fort Huachuca, the layover in Louisiana, the inability to purchase coffee at any lunchroom except the train station, and the requirement to eat in the kitchen rather than the dining area. Then came his description of the German prisoners entering the lunchroom at 11:30 in the morning, sitting at tables, being served meals, talking, smoking, having quite a swell time. The letter concluded with questions that cut to the heart of American hypocrisy. Here is a question that each Negro soldier is asking. What is the Negro soldier fighting for? On whose team are we playing? Are these men sworn enemies of this country? Are they not taught to hate and destroy all democratic governments? Are we not American soldiers, sworn to fight for and die if need be for this our country? Then why are they treated better than we are? Why are we pushed around like cattle? If we are fighting for the same thing, if we are to die for our country, then why does the government allow such things to go on? Trimingham added a final observation that demonstrated both his doubt and his hope. Some of the boys are saying that you will not print this letter. I'm saying that you will. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Yank editors received what they described as a great number of comments from GIs, almost all of whom were outraged by the treatment given to Corporal Trimingham. The letter was extracted from Yank and widely quoted in other publications. Radio programs dramatized the incident. Writer Robert McLaughlin based a short story, A Short Wait Between Trains, on Trimingham's account, published in The New Yorker on June 17, 1944. The story was republished multiple times and adapted for stage productions. Trimingham himself received 287 letters in response to his published letter. 183 came from white men and women in the armed services. Most surprising to Trimingham, the majority of these white correspondents were from the Deep South. They were proud of being Southern. Trimingham wrote in a follow-up letter published July 28, 1944, but ashamed to learn that there are so many of their own people who by their actions and manner toward the Negro are playing Hitler's game. The letters revealed something crucial about American attitudes. Many white soldiers recognized the fundamental injustice of treating enemy combatants better than fellow Americans. They understood that such treatment undermined the very principles America claimed to defend against fascism. They saw, perhaps for the first time, how deeply racism contradicted American ideals. Nevertheless, it gives me new hope, Trimingham wrote, to realize that there are doubtless thousands of whites who are willing to fight this Frankenstein that so many white people are keeping alive. But public opinion and individual sympathy could not immediately change military policy or Southern law. The segregation continued. The contradictions persisted, and black soldiers continued documenting their experiences, writing letters home, corresponding with civil rights organizations, and publishing accounts in the black press that kept pressure on military and political leadership. The extent of the contradiction became even more apparent when examining specific locations where German prisoners and black soldiers occupied the same general area. Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, where Trimingham had been stationed, housed both black troops and German prisoners at different times. Documentation from soldiers stationed there confirmed that German prisoners enjoyed freedom of movement and access to facilities denied to black American soldiers serving at the same installation. Sergeant Edward Donald, stationed at Camp Claiborne, testified that German POWs were given freedom of movement and had access to facilities denied Black American soldiers. The prisoners could move relatively freely within designated areas. They could purchase items at canteens. They could attend recreational activities. Black soldiers faced constant restrictions, required armed guards even for minor infractions, and remained confined to segregated sections of the base. The situation repeated across hundreds of installations. At Fort Huachuca, Arizona, where Trimmingham eventually arrived, German prisoners from the nearby POW camp at Camp Florence sometimes worked on base or in the surrounding area. Black soldiers stationed at Fort Huachuca, the largest training facility for black troops, observed German prisoners receiving courteous treatment while they themselves faced discrimination both on base and in nearby towns. Texas hosted some of the largest concentrations of German prisoners due to its extensive agricultural needs and numerous military installations. By the war's end, tens of thousands of German prisoners worked throughout the state. Black soldiers stationed at Texas bases like Camp Hood, Fort Sam Houston, and others witnessed the same pattern. German prisoners accessed restaurants, shops, and public facilities that explicitly excluded Black Americans in uniform. The policy extended to guard duty assignments. Initially, the U.S. military refused to assign black soldiers as guards for German prisoners, arguing that doing so would invite enemy reprisals because international law banned the humiliation of captured enemy personnel. Military authorities reasoned that forcing German prisoners to submit to authority from black guards would constitute such humiliation. The policy meant that black soldiers, despite their American citizenship and military service, were deemed unsuitable to supervise enemy combatants. This guard policy changed in April 1944, the same month Trimmingham wrote his letter, when the segregated escort guard system was disbanded and black soldiers were permitted to assume guard roles within the United States. However, even after this policy change, many installations continued informal practices that minimized black authority over German prisoners. German prisoners who worked as waiters in mess halls were not permitted to serve black soldiers, another indication of the military's priority of maintaining white supremacy over operational efficiency. The work program for German prisoners was designed not merely to address labor shortages, but also to re-educate prisoners in democratic values. Military authorities hoped that exposure to American life, American abundance, and American principles would transform prisoners into advocates for democracy who would help build a democratic post-war Germany. Prisoners attended classes on American history, geography, government, and the benefits of democratic capitalism. They observed American prosperity firsthand through their work assignments and interactions with civilians. The irony was profound. Re-education efforts aimed at teaching German prisoners about democracy and equality operated simultaneously with a military system that denied those very principles to black American soldiers. German prisoners could see clearly that skin color determined who benefited from American democracy. They witnessed black soldiers being denied access to facilities that welcomed captured enemy combatants. They observed the contradiction between American rhetoric about freedom and American practice of racial segregation. Nazi propaganda had long exploited American racism as evidence of democratic hypocrisy. During the war, German and Japanese propaganda highlighted American treatment of black citizens to argue that the Allies fought not for freedom but for maintaining their own systems of racial oppression. The Soviet Union would later employ similar tactics during the Cold War, pointing to American racial injustice as proof that American claims of moral superiority were fraudulent. The treatment of German prisoners versus black soldiers provided perfect ammunition for such propaganda. When captured, German soldiers could eat in restaurants denied to black American soldiers, when they could use public facilities prohibited to black citizens, when they received courteous treatment while black servicemen faced hostility and violence. It confirmed everything Nazi propagandists had claimed about American racial hierarchy. Some historians have argued that the favorable treatment of German prisoners reflected American attitudes toward Germans as fellow white Europeans, despite their enemy status. A November 1943 poll found that 74% of Americans blamed the German government rather than German people for the war. This attitude meant that individual German soldiers, once captured, could be seen as victims of Nazi leadership rather than irredeemable enemies. Their whiteness allowed them access to facilities and courtesies denied to Black Americans regardless of the latter's citizenship or military service. The distinction operated at a fundamental level of American racial ideology. German prisoners, despite being enemy combatants who had fought to destroy the United States, were white Europeans whose racial classification granted them privileges in American society. Black soldiers, despite being American citizens fighting for their country, remained subject to Jim Crow laws that defined them as inferior based solely on race. The conflict between these two realities created cognitive dissonance that many white Americans preferred to ignore, but that Black Americans could not escape. Daily life for Black soldiers meant navigating this contradiction constantly. Every interaction with German prisoners, every observation of their treatment, every instance of witnessing enemy combatants receive courtesies denied to American servicemen reinforced the injustice. Black soldiers discussed these experiences in barracks conversations, in letters home, in correspondence with civil rights organizations, and in submissions to publications like Yank that occasionally published their perspectives. The black press played a crucial role in documenting and publicizing these contradictions. Newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, and others maintained the WWII campaign throughout the war. They published letters from soldiers, reported on specific incidents of discrimination, challenged military policies, and kept pressure on both military leadership and political figures to address racial injustice. White civilian journalists occasionally covered these stories as well, particularly after Trimmingham's letter gained national attention. The incident inspired not only McLaughlin's New Yorker story, but also radio dramatizations and eventually stage productions. These creative works brought the contradiction to audiences who might not otherwise have encountered accounts from Black soldiers, creating broader awareness of the injustice, even if immediate policy changes remained elusive. The situation was particularly stark for Black soldiers who had combat experience. Members of units like the 992nd Infantry Division, the 761st Tank Battalion, and the Tuskegee Airmen had proven their capability in battle. They had faced enemy fire, completed difficult missions, and demonstrated courage under conditions that many white soldiers never experienced. Yet upon returning to bases in the United States or traveling through American communities, they encountered the same discrimination, the same segregation, the same denial of dignity that affected all Black soldiers regardless of their combat record. The Tuskegee Airmen represented a particularly powerful example of this contradiction. These pilots had trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, overcoming enormous obstacles to become military aviators, at a time when many white Americans insisted Black men lacked the intelligence and temperament for such roles. They flew combat missions in Europe, earning distinguished unit citations and establishing extraordinary records escorting bombers. Multiple Tuskegee Airmen recalled the shock of witnessing German prisoners' access facilities denied to them, as Charles Dryden described at that South Carolina base where POWs entered the white side of the cafeteria while Black officers could not. Similar experiences affected Black sailors, who faced their own particular challenges within the Navy's segregated structure. The Navy had initially restricted Black personnel to mess attendant roles, positions serving food to white officers and sailors. Only after significant pressure from President Roosevelt and civil rights organizations did the Navy begin recruiting Black sailors for other positions in April 1942. However, the Navy relegated Black sailors to segregated units and provided limited opportunities for advancement. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Marine Corps resisted accepting Black recruits until political pressure forced the issue. Major General Thomas Holcomb, the Marine Corps commandant, openly resented being compelled to accept Black Marines. The Corps established a segregated training facility at Montford Point, North Carolina, where Black recruits trained separately from white Marines. Despite excelling at gunnery and drill, these Montford Point Marines faced the same segregation and hostility as servicemen in other branches. The Marine Corps refused to commission any black officers until November 1945, months after the war ended in Europe. The absurdity reached extraordinary levels in individual incidents documented throughout the war. In North Carolina, a policeman slapped Edgar Cole's official orders out of his hand and told him he was not allowed to wait on a street corner for a Marine driver to pick him up and take him to Montford Point. In Cleveland, Ohio, Private R.J. Wood was arrested for impersonating a Marine when he traveled home on leave in May 1943. The police officers did not know that black Marines existed. These incidents revealed how deeply segregation had become embedded in American society, to the point where the mere presence of a black person in military uniform seemed impossible or fraudulent to white civilians and law enforcement. Meanwhile, German prisoners often developed friendly relationships with American civilians in communities near POW camps. In rural areas where prisoner labor was essential to agricultural production, farmers and their families sometimes invited German prisoners to share meals. During holidays, some communities organized gift programs for prisoners. The Amarillo Daily News reported in December 1944 on Texas families welcoming enemy prisoners as temporary neighbors rather than adversaries, recognizing these young men as victims of circumstance rather than threats. These acts of civilian hospitality toward enemy combatants stood in stark contrast to the hostility and violence that black soldiers regularly encountered. Black servicemen could not safely enter many southern communities. They faced threats from local police, attacks from white civilians, and systematic exclusion from businesses and public spaces. The same communities that extended Christmas invitations to German prisoners might lynch a black soldier for the perceived offense of not showing sufficient deference to white authority. The situation created what some black soldiers and civil rights leaders described as a double warfare. Black Americans fought against fascism overseas, while simultaneously fighting against racism at home. They battled Axis forces in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, while battling for basic dignity and equal treatment in their own country. The phrase "double V" captured this dual struggle, but the lived reality meant constant psychological strain, ongoing humiliation, and profound disillusionment with American promises of freedom and equality. Some black soldiers found temporary respite when stationed abroad, particularly in Britain and liberated areas of Europe. British civilians, while not free from racial prejudice, generally treated black American soldiers with more courtesy and less overt hostility than they experienced in the American South. British communities did not enforce American-style segregation, and many British civilians actively rejected American attempts to impose Jim Crow practices in Britain. This more equitable treatment in Britain highlighted for black soldiers just how artificial and unnecessary American segregation was. They recognized that the discrimination they faced at home resulted from deliberate policy choices rather than inevitable social arrangements. If British civilians could treat them with basic respect, if French communities could welcome them without segregation, then American racism was a choice that could be changed rather than an immutable fact of nature. Ebony magazine captured this sentiment in an article about black soldiers in occupied Germany, stating that black GIs enjoyed more friendship and equality in Berlin than in Birmingham or on Broadway. Liberated Europe meant something quite unique to black servicemen. It offered them a glimpse of what life could be without constant racial oppression, and it made returning to American segregation even more painful and infuriating. The question Corporal Trimmingham posed in his April 1944 letter remained unanswered throughout the war. What is the Negro soldier fighting for? On whose team are we playing? These questions haunted black servicemen as they witnessed German prisoners receiving better treatment than American soldiers. The questions persisted as they risked their lives in combat, while their families at home faced discrimination, violence, and systematic denial of opportunities. The questions demanded answers that American political and military leadership seemed unwilling or unable to provide. President Franklin Roosevelt, despite pressure from civil rights leaders like Philip Randolph and Walter White, refused to desegregate the military during the war. Roosevelt feared losing political support from Southern Democrats who formed a crucial part of his coalition. He prioritized maintaining that political alliance over addressing racial injustice within the armed forces. This calculation meant that segregation would continue throughout the war, despite growing evidence of its operational inefficiency, negative impact on morale, and contradiction of stated American war aims. Military commanders offered various justifications for maintaining segregation. Some argued that integration would harm unit cohesion and military effectiveness, despite lack of evidence supporting this claim. Others contended that the military should not be used as a laboratory for social experimentation, as Secretary of War Stimson phrased it. Still others simply reflected the prevailing racist attitudes of American society, believing that black soldiers were inherently inferior and required separation from white troops. These justifications crumbled when examined against actual evidence. When the military did experiment with integration in limited circumstances, particularly during desperate manpower shortages in Europe late in the war, integrated units performed effectively. Black soldiers demonstrated competence in every role they were permitted to fill, from combat infantry to aviation to specialized technical positions. The arguments for segregation rested on racial prejudice rather than military necessity. The treatment of German prisoners versus black soldiers also undermined arguments about operational efficiency. The elaborate system of segregation required duplicate facilities, separate supply chains, complex administrative structures, and significant additional resources. It created inefficiencies and complications that integrated forces would have avoided. The military maintained this costly, complicated segregation system not for operational reasons, but to accommodate white racial prejudice. The cost of maintaining segregation extended beyond material resources to include psychological damage, lost opportunities, and moral compromise. Black soldiers who possessed valuable skills found themselves assigned to menial labor. Talented leaders remained in subordinate positions because of racial restrictions on promotion. The military denied itself the full benefit of more than 1 million black servicemen's capabilities by insisting on maintaining racial hierarchy. German prisoners, meanwhile, benefited from a system designed to maximize their productivity while ensuring humane treatment. They received training, education, and opportunities for personal development even while imprisoned. Many prisoners learned English, studied American history and government, and acquired skills that would serve them well after repatriation. The contrast between investment in enemy prisoners' development and restriction of black soldiers' opportunities was not lost on those who observed both systems operating simultaneously. The mathematics of the contradiction were stark. The United States held 371,683 German prisoners at the war's peak in May 1945. These prisoners received Geneva Convention protections, adequate food, decent housing, educational opportunities, and generally respectful treatment. More than 1 million black Americans served in the military during the same period. They faced segregation, discrimination, inadequate facilities, restricted opportunities, and systematic disrespect despite their American citizenship and military service. German prisoners worked throughout the American economy, filling critical labor shortages. They picked cotton and harvested vegetables. They worked in canneries and sawmills. They constructed roads and buildings. They performed essential work that kept the agricultural and industrial economy functioning during wartime labor shortages. Black soldiers also performed essential work, but their labor came with indignity, restriction, and denial of the basic respect accorded to enemy combatants. The prisoner work program generated significant revenue for the United States government. The War Department collected $22 million in 1944 from prisoner wages, while estimating it saved $80 million that year by using prisoners at military installations. This economic benefit came from paying prisoners minimal wages while charging civilian employers and military installations for their labor. The system extracted value from enemy prisoners while treating them humanely according to international law. Black soldiers received military pay, but their effective economic situation was often worse than that of German prisoners. Segregation meant black soldiers could not access many post exchanges, recreational facilities, or civilian businesses where they might spend their wages. They faced systematic exclusion from programs, benefits, and opportunities available to white soldiers. The economic impact of discrimination reduced their actual purchasing power and limited their ability to support families at home. After the war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, the contrast between German prisoners and black soldiers became even more pronounced. German prisoners who had experienced American abundance, American fairness, and American respect often expressed gratitude for their treatment. One prisoner who corresponded with 80 fellow ex-prisoners after returning to Germany reported that no re-education had been necessary in the camps because they had become convinced Democrats due to their treatment. Black soldiers returning from overseas service faced a very different reception. They came home to a nation that had not changed during their absence. Jim Crow laws remained fully in force throughout the South. Racial violence actually increased as white Americans, particularly in the South, perceived black veterans in uniform as a threat to the racial order. Between 1945 and 1946, numerous black veterans were attacked, beaten, and in some cases murdered by white mobs and law enforcement officers who resented their military service. Isaac Woodard, a black Army sergeant, was brutally beaten and blinded by police in South Carolina in February 1946, just hours after receiving an honorable discharge. Harry T. Moore, a civil rights activist and veteran, was killed along with his wife when their home was bombed in Florida on Christmas Day, 1951. These attacks represented a broader pattern of violence targeting black veterans who returned expecting to claim the full rights of American citizenship after having fought for American freedom overseas. The GI Bill, officially the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, promised comprehensive benefits to returning veterans, including tuition assistance, job placement, home loans, and business loans. In practice, discrimination prevented many black veterans from accessing these benefits. Southern banks refused home loans to black applicants regardless of their military service. Universities, particularly in the South, denied admission to black veterans. Job placement services directed black veterans to menial positions regardless of their qualifications or military training. The cumulative effect was that white veterans, including those who had never seen combat, received substantial government assistance that helped build middle-class prosperity in the post-war decades. Black veterans, despite their service and sacrifice, were systematically excluded from these opportunities. The GI Bill became another mechanism through which American society rewarded whiteness while penalizing blackness, even among those who had served their country in uniform. German prisoners, by contrast, returned to Germany with skills, education, and often positive impressions of American society. Approximately 5,000 German ex-prisoners eventually emigrated to the United States, taking advantage of their wartime experiences and connections to build new lives in America. Thousands more returned to visit. Some became prominent in post-war German business, government, and education, carrying with them memories of fair treatment during their captivity. The irony was complete. Enemy soldiers who had fought against the United States were welcomed to immigrate and build successful American lives. Black Americans who had fought for the United States faced continuing discrimination, violence, and systematic exclusion from opportunities. Whiteness, even enemy whiteness, granted access that black citizenship could not provide. The accumulation of these experiences, documented in thousands of letters, articles, testimonies, and personal accounts, built pressure for change. Civil rights organizations like the NAACP continued advocating for military desegregation. The black press maintained focus on the contradiction between American rhetoric about freedom and American practice of racial oppression. Black veterans themselves became increasingly active in civil rights organizing, bringing their military experience and sense of having earned full citizenship through service. President Harry Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt after his death in April 1945, faced this pressure with increasing urgency. Truman had not initially been considered a civil rights advocate. He came from Missouri, a border state with its own history of racial segregation. But as president, Truman encountered the reality of American racism through multiple channels. He received reports about violence against black veterans. He heard from civil rights leaders about continuing discrimination. He recognized that American claims to moral leadership in the emerging Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union were undermined by domestic racial injustice. The Trimingham letter and the broader pattern of treating German prisoners better than black soldiers formed part of the evidence that convinced Truman action was necessary. The letter had been widely published and discussed. It had inspired creative works that reached broad audiences. It had generated correspondence from service members, including white Southern soldiers, expressing outrage at the injustice. The incident represented a crystallization of the broader contradiction that could not be ignored or dismissed. On July 26, 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, declaring that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. The order established the President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services to oversee implementation. It represented the first major federal action against racial segregation since Reconstruction. The executive order did not immediately end military segregation. Implementation occurred gradually over several years, with full integration not achieved until the Korean War in the early 1950s. Resistance from military commanders, particularly in the Army, slowed the process. Some branches moved more quickly than others. The Air Force, newly established as a separate service in 1947, integrated relatively rapidly. The Army, with its entrenched segregation practices and Southern-dominated officer corps, took longer. But the order represented a crucial turning point. It established federal authority to combat racial discrimination. It demonstrated that change was possible, despite fierce opposition. It validated the arguments that black soldiers, civil rights leaders, and progressive white allies had been making throughout the war. And it occurred in direct response to the documented injustices that men like Corporal Rupert Trimingham had courageously publicized. Trimingham himself did not live to see the full impact of his letter. He continued working as an electrician after the war, repairing sewing machines for Singer. He married a librarian and lived quietly in Brooklyn, New York. The incident at that Louisiana train station had profoundly affected him. He had been very religious before watching German prisoners receive better treatment than American soldiers. That faith was shattered by the experience, though his willingness to speak publicly about the injustice demonstrated a different kind of courage. Trimingham died in May 1985 at age 85. By then, the military he had served had been integrated for more than 3 decades. Black Americans served in all ranks and specialties without official restriction. The changes he had advocated through his simple, powerful letter had been implemented. The question he had asked, "What is the Negro soldier fighting for?" had received at least a partial answer in the form of military integration and expanding civil rights protections. The story of German prisoners receiving better treatment than black soldiers became a powerful symbol in civil rights advocacy. It appeared in books, documentaries, academic studies, and public discussions about American racial history. The PBS series American Experience featured actor Courtney B. Vance reading Trimingham's Yank letter as part of its presentation, War Letters, broadcast in November 2001. The incident continued to resonate because it captured so vividly the contradiction between American ideals and American practices. Historians who studied this period identified the treatment of German POWs versus black soldiers as an important factor in the eventual desegregation of the military and the broader civil rights movement. Matthias Rice published a comprehensive study in 2004 analyzing letters from black soldiers documenting these experiences. The research confirmed that the preferential treatment of German prisoners seemed, at times, specifically designed to humiliate black soldiers. The phenomenon extended beyond individual incidents to represent a systemic pattern. At Camp Gordon Johnston in Florida, black servicemen were assigned to dispose of human waste for the entire camp, including German prisoners. In Utah, German prisoners refused to work for black supervisors, and white officers supported their refusal. In Mississippi, POW camps provided white latrines for German prisoners while segregating black soldiers to inferior facilities. At bases throughout the South and Southwest, German prisoners accessed movie theaters, post exchanges, and recreational facilities denied to black Americans in uniform. These were not isolated incidents or accidental occurrences. They reflected deliberate policy choices and deeply embedded racial ideology. American society, in the 1940s, operated on the premise that racial hierarchy was natural, necessary, and beneficial. This ideology shaped military policy, civilian law, economic structures, and social relationships. German prisoners, despite being enemy combatants, were white Europeans and therefore granted privileges within this racial hierarchy. Black Americans, despite being citizens and soldiers, remained subject to Jim Crow restrictions. The cognitive dissonance this created was profound. America fought a war against Nazi Germany, whose racial ideology had led to genocide and global conflict. American propaganda emphasized democracy, freedom, and human dignity as distinguishing American values from Nazi totalitarianism. Yet American society practiced its own form of racial segregation that bore uncomfortable similarities to Nazi racial laws. Indeed, Nazi racial theorists had studied American segregation practices when developing their own policies in the 1930s. German prisoners observed this contradiction directly. They saw black soldiers treated as inferior despite their American citizenship and military service. They noticed that their own whiteness granted them privileges in American society that black Americans could not access. Some prisoners found this amusing, as documented in accounts of Germans laughing at segregated trains or smirking at black soldiers forced into inferior positions. Others recognized the hypocrisy and questioned American sincerity about democratic values. The impact on black soldiers was psychological as well as material. The daily experience of seeing enemy combatants treated better than American servicemen created lasting trauma and bitterness. It reinforced doubts about America's commitment to equality. It validated skepticism about whether fighting for American freedom overseas would lead to freedom for black Americans at home. Some soldiers lost faith entirely, concluding that American democracy was a facade covering brutal racial oppression. Yet many black soldiers also found reason for hope. The response to Trimmingham's letter demonstrated that some white Americans recognized the injustice and opposed it. The 287 letters Trimmingham received, 183 from whites mostly in the South, showed that racial attitudes could change. The widespread publication of his account and public discussion of the contradiction created pressure for reform. Even if change came slowly, the fact that change was possible sustained hope. The story also revealed the power of individual testimony. Trimmingham was not a prominent civil rights leader or influential politician. He was a corporal in the Army Corps of Engineers, an electrician by trade, stationed far from centers of power. But he witnessed an injustice, wrote about it clearly and powerfully, and trusted that publication would make a difference. His simple letter to Yank magazine became one of the most influential documents in the movement toward military desegregation. This pattern repeated throughout American history. Individual acts of courage, personal testimonies, and willingness to speak truth about injustice created momentum for change even when immediate results seemed impossible. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. John Lewis marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Countless unnamed individuals who filed lawsuits, wrote letters, organized protests, and demanded equality, despite facing violence, economic retaliation, and social ostracism. Trimmingham's contribution was particularly significant because it came during wartime when pressure to maintain unity and avoid controversy was intense. Military authorities could have censored his letter. Yank editors could have declined to publish it. The military could have retaliated against him for publicly criticizing segregation policy. Instead, the letter was published, widely distributed, and became a catalyst for national discussion. The fact that this occurred demonstrates that even in difficult circumstances, truth-telling can break through official silence and create space for change. The treatment of German prisoners and black soldiers also illuminated the nature of American racial ideology. Race in America was not primarily about biology or cultural difference. It was about power, hierarchy, and control. German prisoners, despite being actual enemies who had fought to destroy the United States, could be incorporated into the white American social structure because they were European. Their enemy status was temporary and circumstantial. Their racial classification was permanent and fundamental. Black Americans, regardless of their citizenship, military service, education, or accomplishments, remained subject to racial restrictions because American racial ideology defined them as inferior. No amount of patriotism, bravery, or achievement could overcome the barrier of racial classification. This was the lesson that black soldiers learned through bitter experience during World War II. Yet this painful lesson also strengthened resolve. If race was about power rather than biology, then racial inequality could be challenged and changed through political action. If segregation was maintained by law and policy rather than natural necessity, then law and policy could be reformed. The experiences of World War II, including the contradiction of German prisoners treated better than black soldiers, and contributed to the growth of civil rights consciousness that would fuel the movement of the 1950s and 60s. Many leaders of that later civil rights movement were World War II veterans. Approximately one-third of civil rights leaders in the 1950s and 60s had served during the war. Their military experience gave them organizational skills, leadership training, and a sense of having earned full citizenship through service. Their wartime experiences with segregation and discrimination gave them first-hand knowledge of injustice and motivation to fight for change. Their exposure to more equitable treatment in Europe gave them a vision of what integrated society could look like. The story of Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, watching German prisoners enjoy lunch while he stood in a kitchen doorway, became more than a single incident. It became a symbol of American hypocrisy, a rallying point for civil rights advocacy, and evidence that change was necessary. The image of enemy soldiers receiving better treatment than American citizens in uniform captured the absurdity of racial segregation in a way that volumes of social science, research, or political philosophy could not match. The power of the story lay in its simplicity and clarity. No complex analysis was needed to recognize the injustice. A black American soldier, traveling to his next duty station, could not buy a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. German prisoners of war, captured while fighting against the United States, were served full meals at tables in the same establishment. The contradiction was obvious. The question Trimmingham asked, "Are we not American soldiers, sworn to fight for and die if need be for this our country? Then why are they treated better than we are?" had no satisfactory answer within the framework of racial segregation. This question echoed through American consciousness in the decades that followed. It appeared in textbooks and documentaries. It was taught in schools and discussed in universities. It became part of the national conversation about race, justice, and American identity. And it continued to resonate because the underlying issues: who belongs, who deserves dignity, how America reconciles its ideals with its practices, remained unresolved. The experience of German prisoners in America also revealed something about the possibilities of human connection across enemy lines. Many prisoners developed genuine friendships with American civilians and guards. They experienced kindness from families who invited them to holiday meals. They received education and training that served them well after returning home. Some returned to the United States to build American lives, contributing to their adopted country. These positive interactions demonstrated that even during wartime, common humanity could bridge national divisions. The contrast with treatment of black Americans was therefore even more painful. If Americans could extend generosity and respect to enemy soldiers, why could they not extend the same to their own black citizens? If German prisoners could be welcomed into American homes and communities, why were black Americans excluded from public facilities and neighborhoods? The answer lay in racial ideology that valued European whiteness over American citizenship, enemy status notwithstanding. This racial hierarchy had long historical roots in American society. From the beginning, American identity was constructed in racial terms with whiteness as the essential qualification for full citizenship. The Constitution counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, while denying them any rights. The Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted citizenship to free white persons. Throughout American history, whiteness served as a passport to rights and opportunities denied to those classified as non-white. World War II created a crisis for this racial system. America fought against Nazi racial ideology while practicing its own form of racial segregation. American propaganda emphasized freedom and democracy, while American society denied those values to millions of black citizens. The treatment of German prisoners versus black soldiers made this contradiction impossible to ignore. Something had to give. The resolution came gradually through executive orders, court decisions, legislative action, and social movement organizing. Military integration under Truman's executive order. Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, declaring school segregation unconstitutional. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, prohibiting discrimination in public accommodations and employment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, protecting black voting rights. Each advance faced fierce resistance, but each moved American society closer to fulfilling its stated ideals. Corporal Rupert Trimingham did not live to see all these changes, but his letter contributed to making them possible. By documenting what he witnessed, asking the right questions, and trusting that truth would matter, he helped expose the contradiction at the heart of American race relations. His courage in speaking publicly about injustice, even when uncertain whether his letter would be published, demonstrated the power of individual testimony to create change. The story reminds us that history is shaped not only by famous leaders and major events, but also by ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice. Trimingham was a corporal, not a general. He was an electrician, not a politician. He wrote a letter to a magazine, not a book or manifesto. Yet his simple account of standing in a kitchen doorway watching German prisoners enjoy privileges denied to him became one of the most powerful documents in American civil rights history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.